Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's National Center for Rural Road Safety's January webinar on the results of the Safety Center's research project called Assessing the Operational and Cultural Environment. We're going to get started now. It looks like most of you have filled out the poll questions along the outside of the screen for us, and we have about 40% of you joining us today from state DOTs, 30% from local transportation departments, and about 14% from federal. Today's presentation, so that you guys are aware, is going to go through the research project, which these first 2 years have been focused on state DOTs. The upcoming research, which will be started in about a month, will be the same types of surveys and research, but done for local entities. So we're glad to have all of you here with us today so that you can find out what we have done and what will be occurring very shortly. It looks like most of you are attending by yourself, but we do have a few of you in groups. For those of you in groups, as always, please email us a list of attendees and email addresses to info@ruralsafetycenter.org. That will allow us to send you our survey at the completion of today's webinar. That survey is how you go about getting CEUs and certificates of completion for today's webinar. So if we do not have you already registered for today's webinar, we will need your email addresses. It looks like we have a good cross-section from across the U.S. However, we do have a pretty good majority coming from the western U.S. with about 45%. And most of you are joining us by computer only. However, we do have quite a few of you both computer and phone. For those of you joining us only on the computer, if at any time you do have sound issues, we would encourage you to call in on the phone line. Sometimes a Wi-Fi can make it a little bit harder for you to hear through the computer. So again, if you do run into any issues, we would ask you to call in as well. So at this point, I'm going to move us over to our presentation. Okay, and for today's presentation, we do have 3 speakers, and I'll read their bios to you in just a few minutes. We have a few webinar logistics for you I'd like to go over. This webinar will last an hour and a half. It is currently being recorded and will be archived on our website, so if you do have anyone you'd like to share it with in the future, it will be available. For quality of our recording, all of the phone lines other than our speakers have been muted. And again, I'd ask all 3 of our speakers, please keep your personal phone line muted when you're not speaking, because we can hear some feedback coming through. If you are listening on the phone, please also mute your computer, as you will hear feedback between the 2 if you don't have the computer muted. If you'd like to maximize the presentation, there are 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of your screen that you can click on, and that will make the PowerPoint presentation full screen. Again, there's the handout pod, which is now showing up at the bottom center of your screen, where you can download our PDF of today's presentation. That PDF will also be available with the archived streaming version of this webinar later on our website as well. And again, we do have follow-up surveys. We have one that occurs directly following today's webinar. That one will ask you for some questions about the content and the speakers themselves, but it will also allow you to check a box as to whether or not you'd like a certificate of completion for today's webinar, and or if you'd like to be able to apply for CEUs, which are available through a partner department at the Montana State University. So within a couple of weeks of that survey being completed, we will send you a certificate of completion, as well as the form that you would need to fill out and submit to our partner department at Montana State University for those CEUs. In about 3 months, we'll send a follow-up survey, and that one lets us know whether or not you were able to use any of the information that you learned in today's webinar, if you shared it with anyone at your job, or if you have taken this information and used it to make a change as well. So for today's presenters, we have Nick Ward, who is a professor at Montana State University. He obtained his PhD in psychology from Queen's University in Canada. He is currently a professor of mechanical and industrial engineering at Montana State University. His more than 20 years leading international research applied to traffic safety has been based on a systems perspective focused on the driver, the vehicle, and the infrastructure. Over this time period, Professor Ward has secured over $15 million in research grants from government, commercial, and nonprofit organizations. Currently, he is the director of the Center for Health and Safety Culture at the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. He is also a founding member of the National Summit for Roadway Safety Culture and the Transportation Research Board Subcommittee on Roadway Safety Culture, an international leader in advancement of traffic safety culture paradigm. We also have Jay Otto today, who is from Montana State University. He is a research scientist for the Center for Health and Safety Culture at the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. He received a bachelor's and a master's degree in engineering from MIT. He leads the research efforts for the center as well as participates in research projects. He is fascinated by human behavior, how systems influence behavior, and the role of culture. His issues of interest include substance abuse prevention, traffic safety, and violence prevention. And we also have Dana Gaines today from Cambridge Systematics. Dana is a PhD, is a senior associate of Cambridge Systematics with 10 years of experience in transportation safety planning, safety data analysis and evaluation, and traffic safety research. She provides project management support on national, state, and local transportation safety planning projects. Her research background and professional experience include developing and conducting surveys and interviews to collect transportation safety planning practices and culture challenges for state DOTs, metropolitan planning organizations, and local governments, implementing and evaluating strategic highway safety plans, and turning research and states of practice into practitioner-based guidebooks. So we thank you all for being here today. Today's webinar, the goal of today's webinar is that once all of our participants have finished it, we hope you have an overview of the program of research that was undertaken by the Safety Center in the past 2 years to understand the cultural and operational factors within traffic safety organizations that predict utilization of effective resources and tools for workforce training and education. To achieve this webinar goal, we're going to talk to you about 3 different learning outcomes. The first is to describe a proposed model that relates cultural factors of an organization to the access and utilization of workforce training. The second will be to understand which factors are most predictive of access and utilization with a sample of state DOTs. And the third is to discuss different forms of strategies that state DOTs can undertake to increase future utilization of workforce training and education tools and resources. Just a reminder that over on the left-hand side, before we get started, is a chat pod. In that chat pod, you're more than welcome to put any questions that you may have for our speakers as they are discussing, and I will go back to those at the end of each section. So at the end of each of these talking points, we will have a question and answer period, but again, feel free to put your questions in there at any time. And now I will turn this presentation over to Nick. Nick? Nick, are you still on the phone? Jay, can we hear you at this point? Can you unmute and be heard?
Yes. So I have a bad suspicion that Nick may have muted himself and is having difficulty time unmuting, but I can jump in, and Nick, if you return, just jump right in and take over. So this first session, we're just going to set up the model that we use to help connect, and the background context for helping connect this idea of cultural factors of an organization and access and utilization of workforce training. We know the big picture around the Rural Road Safety Project is increasing or addressing and improving safety across communities, states, and the nation, and using building capacity of the workforce around evidence-based strategies and practices and decision-making to help improve safety. And our goal was to look at what are some cultural factors that start to impact and influence both access to training as well as utilization there. The premise, oh, go ahead, Nick.
You think at my level of experience I could use a phone, but apparently not. I just changed phones. Sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you, Jay, for stepping in. So just to get back to the premise underlying our particular research project, one of our starting premises was that we recognized that one of the important goals for transportation agencies is to engage in workforce training to increase their knowledge and skills around strategies and processes to ensure increased road safety. However, having access to effective resource training is key to that particular goal. And aside from having access, we need to recognize that the role of the culture within the organization can affect the extent to which those resources are utilized. So if the prevailing culture does not value workforce training, it's unlikely that even the most effective workforce training resources will be used because there won't be access and utilization, and there's a risk that safety knowledge and skills could stagnate within the organization. So the overall conclusion and motivation for this research project was to support the safety centers, a center of excellence in workforce training, to understand what cultural factors within transportation agencies support access and utilization of workforce training resources and the transfer of that knowledge and skill to the job itself, thereby impacting safety outcomes for the areas that those agencies are responsible for. And to give sort of an analogy for why we're focusing on culture within this particular research project, rather than workforce training tools specifically, is shown here in this analogy. You can imagine a running shoe company or a running shoe store could focus on designing the best shoes possible, and you may sell some shoes, and those shoes may be effective. But to be very effective as a store or an association selling shoes, you want to understand the running culture as well. What is it about the culture of running that motivates people to use particular shoes? So the analogy that we're using here, to transfer to the current research, is if we're developing a center of excellence to support effective research training tools, we need to understand the role of organization culture that drives access to and utilization of those particular tools. In that case, we can help create conditions that not only produce effective workforce training resources, but also create the cultural conditions that motivate access and utilization of those particular tools. So the starting point, we need to understand what we mean by the term organization culture. And there's a long history of research on that particular topic, especially around safety culture as it relates to safety critical domains such as nuclear power plants and hospitals and commercial aircraft and so forth. So there's lots of definitions of what we mean by organization culture, and for the purposes of this webinar today, we've chosen to discuss this particular definition by Otto, which states culture to be the shared values, what is important, and beliefs, how things work, that interact with a company's people's organizational structures and operations to produce behavioral norms, the way we do things around here. So that's a fairly simple but potent definition of organization culture, and we can expand on that as the basis for how we design data collection for this research. This is actually a graphic which expands on that definition in a bit more detail to describe what we mean specifically about organizational culture. And we can start at the bottom with what's referred to as the paradigm of the culture within an organization. And the paradigm of an organization's culture is its core assumptions, specifically what are its primary values, what is most important to the organization, what are they trying to achieve, what is their goal. So for traffic safety agencies, presumably one of their fundamental values is traffic safety, the safety of their employees and the safety of those who use the road system they're responsible for. That would be an example of a value. The system belief is the belief system about what factors impact or influence attaining that goal that affect that value. So for example, a traffic safety agency may have a belief system that the road user is the primary factor causing fatal crashes, and that to improve road safety, you need to change the road user. Alternatively, another agency may believe that you can't change the road user, so you need to focus on automated vehicles as a way to achieve your goal of improved safety. So those are two examples of belief systems. And together, the value in the belief systems forms the paradigm. In turn, the paradigm influences the strategies that that organization will favor. An organization that has a primary value of safety will be focusing on strategies that help increase safety. More specifically, organizations that have a belief system that the driver is the primary factor and you can change the driver's behavior may be focusing on strategies that impact the driver behavior, such as increased enforcement or increased driver education. Whereas another organization having a different belief system may focus on trying to increase automation within the infrastructure and vehicle system of the roadway. In turn, both the paradigm and the strategies get codified within the artifacts of the organization. Artifacts are things that basically embody the paradigm and formalize the strategies in such things as policy, documents, even the organizational structure and processes of the organization. So an example there might be the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, which would not only embody the value that the organization has toward road safety as a primary value, but also emphasize its particular beliefs, perhaps data-driven, about what the primary factors are, and identify the specific strategies that it's identifying to address those factors. That artifact essentially connects and formalizes the paradigm and strategies together, and it provides an enduring method for the strategies and paradigm to be perpetuated through the organization. And it connects everyone together with a common paradigm and a common set of strategies. From that background, talking about organizational culture, we began to develop a predictive model for how culture would influence access, utilization, and transfer of workforce training, resources, knowledge, and skills. And that is a diagram that we see here. This guided how we designed the survey instrument to collect the data. It also guided how we designed the analysis of the data. In essence, this is our hypothesis of the relationship between culture on the left and ultimately the outcome of better traffic safety on the right. So I'll walk through this briefly before we get into the data itself. So the very right end, starting at the back end of the model, our ultimate goal as traffic safety agencies is to improve traffic safety. That presumes, of course, that safety is one of the primary values within the organization's paradigm. So ultimately, we're trying to drive better traffic safety through the use of workforce training resources. To get to that goal, we want to implement strategies that are more effective in improving traffic safety. Traditional methods that are more effective, as well as innovative strategies that show us new ways to get to our safety goal. Of course, the connection between using effective strategies that we sort of calculate or estimate to be effective and actually getting our safety goals depends a lot on the context in which we're implementing these strategies. And some of this context is out of our control. So for example, there may be aspects of the road environment that will still contribute to a certain degree of crash risk. We may have a particular high-risk driving population with a risky traffic safety culture, which still has a high risk potential. But nonetheless, we try and do our best duty to identify effective strategies and implement them with the goal of improving traffic safety. So how do we empower our staff to develop best practices in implementing effective traffic safety strategies? And that has to do with access, utilization, and the transfer of knowledge and skills from workforce training resources. And the fundamental question is, what is it about the cultural paradigm within the agencies that would increase or support access, utilization, and transfer. And here we're looking at two aspects of culture within the organization. The first is the safety culture, the extent to which safety is highly valued and prioritized in the organization. We would predict that if that is the case, organizations would encourage access to safety-related workforce training opportunities. But the other aspect of culture is the extent to which organizations and individuals in those organizations value and believe training is an effective, useful tool to improve their functioning in their job roles and ultimately benefit traffic safety. So this is the overall logic that we were trying to validate in the research. It shows the flow between culture, access, utilization, and transfer from workforce training resources, and eventually its impact on the kinds of strategies that are implemented to affect traffic safety goals. With that, I will take a pause and give it back to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Nick. And now we will take questions. Again, if anyone has questions, you can type those into the chat pod on the left-hand side. While we are waiting to see if we have any, I am going to move over to a poll question. The chat pod will still remain over there on the left-hand side. Our first poll question for you is, what defines the paradigm of an organization's culture? Is it strategies and artifacts, values and beliefs, training policies, or action plans? So please take a moment to fill that in. It does look like we have a couple people typing in questions, so that's great. We would encourage you to keep doing so. At this point, I am going to end our poll and broadcast the results so that you can see those, Nick, if you'd like to go ahead and address that.
Yes. Two major sort of responses. The first is strategies and artifacts, and the second is values and beliefs. The paradigm itself is the component of organizational culture which specifically addresses values and belief systems. Strategies and artifacts are essentially an outcome of the values and beliefs, i.e. an outcome of the paradigm itself. And training policies is something that we would consider to be an example of an artifact itself. Okay, Jamie?
Thank you, Nick. And it does look like we do have a question that came in for you. It says, Nick presented in very broad terms. The training is something you see being promoted just within our individual organizations or in our jurisdictions with other employers.
The way, if I understand the question correctly, and I think this will become more clear when Jay starts showing the individual results and Dana gives some follow-up results from our interviews with some of the agencies involved. We're largely focusing on the culture within a given agency and how it addresses training for its staff within its own agency, not taking responsibility for training in the broader space. Does that help?
That's great. Thank you. And GR, if that did not answer your question, please go ahead and put some clarification in the chat pod, and we will get that answered for you as well. Moving back to our presentation, and at this point we will turn it over to Jay. Jay, go ahead.
Great. Thanks a lot, Nick. That really helps with the setup, and I really appreciate you doing that first section instead of me. Next, we want to build on what Nick described and start to get into the way that we sought to understand those factors. So we'll directly build on the model that he introduced. And what we did was to take this model and seek to measure this by developing a series of questions. Most of the constructs or boxes on this model we measured with multiple questions so that we could get an idea and some more understanding. And so we initially developed an internet-based survey. We did some pilot testing of that survey. We then went out and sought for this first phase of the work to recruit DOTs in particular, so departments of transportation across the country. We actually worked with Dana and her crew at Cambridge Systematics and ranked states in terms of safety performance metrics. We looked at a multi-year average from 03 to 13, and here were some of the metrics that we used to help do that ranking. We then sort of put states into quartiles, and we sought to recruit some DOTs, in particular from top quartile and then bottom quartile, so that we could also explore differences based on quartile, sort of overall state, some of the aspects of the state safety performance, but also just bolstering that sense of being different. So we were intentional with sort of spreading it across different DOTs based on safety performance or safety outcomes. In the end, we had 6 states participate, 4 from the top quartile and 2 from the bottom quartile. Within those agencies, we sought to have as broad participation as we could. We wanted to have folks at every level of the organization participate in the survey so we could get a sense from a wide array of participants how they view their agency's culture. As Nick mentioned, we were looking at that, how do some of those cultural factors predict engagement? And so it was important for us not just to look at a small subset of a DOT, but really broadly. Now, some of the DOTs were successful. Most of the DOTs were successful with having broad participation. I think we had 1 or 2 who had much narrower participation. But nonetheless, we were able to get a sense and learn from those as well. I want to give you a quick high-level view of some of the sort of high-level statistics. I won't go into a lot of the statistical techniques we use, but I want to give you a little bit of background, and then we're going to dive in to look at each of these components one at a time. But as you can see, we have a measure for each one of those boxes, which we developed as a scale based on several different items. You can see the means. On all the questions, we used 7-point ranges, so 1 was the lowest and 7 is the highest, and we'll make more meaning of these as we get into it. But you can start to see generally based on the means where things were coming out and the standard deviations. On the right-hand side, we start to see some of the correlations between some of these components. We also then peeled the onion and went into more depth where we did some linear regression and some other techniques to look at these in greater depth, but just to start to get a high-level view. So for example, in terms of some of the means, we can see prioritization of safety was very high among all really participants with a mean of 6.17 out of 7, so it was pretty high. We can see their sense of support for workforce development in general was pretty high. Access was a little bit lower. Then when we start looking at aspects of utilization and their own self-reported safety skills, we can see those as lower as well. When we look at some of the correlation, we can see as we're looking at what was starting to predict access, we can see that prioritization of safety and support for workforce development both significantly correlated with access. We can also see that utilization of resources strongly correlated with access with the 0.49, and ultimately safety skills strongly correlated with utilization for a 0.25. So I'm just giving you this background to show a little bit of the high-level connection of the model, but really what we want to spend some time on is getting into the depth and looking at some of these individual items. So what we're going to do is just briefly walk through and look at each one of the items and talk a little bit about what we learned and how that tied together with predicting or correlating with access and utilization. In prioritization of safety, we looked at several items. Not all of them are included here. As Nick mentioned, we wanted to look at their sense of valuing of safety. How did they value safety potentially relative to other demands? For these items, we asked how they valued safety, and then we also asked them their perception of how others in their organization valued safety. So we asked them about what they thought most of their coworkers thought, their supervisors thought, their sort of senior leadership team or top management thought, and what their director thought. So by looking at both their own responses and how they perceived others valued these items, we could see their own thoughts and also their perception of their organizational culture. We did, as I mentioned, we had 6 agencies participate, and to help I think, incentivize and provide some benefit back to those agencies, we also developed individual agency reports. So we were able to feed back a report just for that agency based on their own agency's responses, and we looked at each item on the survey and helped them see how individuals were believing or their values were, but also how they perceived others. And that's very insightful, I think, for organizations, because sometimes they will find a discrepancy between what people believe and what they think their managers or their top management believe. And that's an opportunity to do some internal training to build focus on some of the communication skills and different things like that with managers, supervisors, and leaders to help correct and align some of those perceptions. So that was just another item that we did. We're not going over one of those sample reports in this presentation just because of time, but that will be available in the final report. We'll talk about that at the end of this webinar. But what we saw overall was that values around protecting health and safety were very high amongst those participating, that road safety should be considered, at those ranked very high. We also asked and used a standardized tool to look at safety climate. And safety climate is focused on the safety climate of their organization. It's not as much focused on their focus on overall transportation safety or the safety of the general public, but really the safety of their agency just as an organization. And it's a scale that's developed and applied to any kind of organization. And we'll talk a little more about that, because that one's, well, when we look at some of the results, that one was ranked a little bit lower, and it was actually a good predictor as we started to look at and understand access to training and utilization of training. So as you can see, some of these that were reported across came out very high. Again, everything was scaled from 1 to 7. But when we look at the safety climate, it was a little bit lower. And again, it also was the item across, we had subscales in these scales, and it was basically the subscale that was most predictive of access and utilization. So that was very interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. But overall, we can see, not unexpected, that safety was very highly prioritized amongst really all the participants that we had across all those 6 agencies. Now, we also wanted to sense and gather some of their values and beliefs around support for workforce development. So for that, we looked at some values in terms of do they view training in general as a valuable investment, and training specifically around improving safety as a valuable investment. So we had several different questions that examined that. We also wanted to explore their own individual beliefs and readiness for training. So these are some things we developed and pulled from the literature. You know, how motivated are you to learn new things? To what degree are you expected to apply new ideas in your job? How much control do you have participating in training? And then, does your organization work with you to identify potential training? And after participating in training, does your supervisor talk about how that training can be applied to your job? All of these are elements that come out of the literature on workforce development as being important conditions to be in place for effective utilization, engagement, and training. So we wanted to examine those and see their relationship. What we found was that people overall were reported being very motivated to learn new things, scoring very high, on that scale of 1 to 7. It was lower in terms of their sense that they were expected to apply new ideas on their job. And that's interesting because that could be a misperception within the culture. And so it's one that we want to bring out. But as people responded about their own situation, they're reporting a lower level there. A lower level in terms of how much control they have with participating, their sense of control in participating in training. The last two items on this graph are scaled to where it's a biphasic response, and on the low side, on the 1, is strongly disagree, and on the high side, 7 is strongly agree. So 4 is a neutral on the last two. And you can see that my organization works with me to identify potential training opportunities. That was slightly agree. A 5 is not a strongly agree. It's a very somewhat agree. So there's definitely opportunity to grow there. But interesting on the last one, this was about neutral, that after participating in training, my supervisor discusses the training with me and how I can apply it to my job. So a real opportunity there, and that the research would say that's a critically important part of effective training, is that after the training, there's engagement by that supervisor to talk about how those skills can be applied in their job role. So some of the key insights we found just from these first two components, that safety climate was a strong correlate with utilization of safety training. And we'll talk a little bit later about some ways to leverage that. But that's interesting, that notion that their internal safety climate. Again, safety climate is about the sense of safety of their organization, not necessarily the focus on the broader transportation system, but just internally their safety climate. And then individual readiness was also a strong predictor of access and utilization. And from what we saw from these 6 DOTs, there's definitely opportunities to enhance some of those components as we look about growing a culture to improve access and engagement with training. So now continuing to walk across the model, we looked at access to traffic safety workforce development. We wanted to look at we looked at access to training and resources at 2 levels. One, just in general, not specific to safety training, but just sort of general training. And then we also looked at it very safety specific. And for the safety specific, we focused on training around certain key skills. But you can see on the general, we were looking at, what is the access for these different styles of training, online, training that's conducted in essence by yourself, sort of asynchronously with materials or books, training that's provided by your organization, and training that's provided by outside agencies. And then with the safety skill, we wanted to look at generally sort of improving the safety of the transportation system, using data to make better decisions, assessing the effectiveness of safety strategies, and then that last one, using safety decisions that result in the most value, or investment decision making. So what we learned was that in terms of general accessibility, online training classes were the most accessible. Not terribly surprising, but I think something important for us to acknowledge. Much lower in terms of folks doing training on their own, but definitely some folks doing that. Training provided by your organization is being the second highest available, and I think that's very important and something we'll come back to. And then training provided by outside agencies. So I think this is important and something to help us see, what are the methods that we need to explore in order to be able to reach folks with training. Then when we looked at accessibility to the specific skill growing training, about similar levels, but we're a little bit lower in terms of that last one about training on safety decisions that result in the most value, or that investment decision making. I think it's a more complex skill. But in general, these are pretty similar. They're running about the middle, again, on a 1 to 7 scale. Certainly some opportunities to improve and grow that, but nonetheless, definitely folks having some sense of it being accessible. We then looked at, so what has been utilization of some of the training? So we could wrap back both their sense of access to it and how did that compare with what they'd actually experienced recently. And we again looked at two components, just sort of their utilization of general training. So we used the past year or 12 months as a look-back period, and how many times have they engaged in various forms of training. And then also we wanted to look at how often they engaged in very safety-specific training. So we could see both of those. Now what we did was, here we divided the population into two groups. We did have some other questions on there so that we could determine if addressing safety was a core component of their job function. In other words, they had not just a general employee, but they had a primary safety role. And we can see that a large number, or certainly the average was that people had engaged in training about their own safety or safety of their coworkers in the past 12 months, so that was good to see. Training about improving the safety of the transportation system, they had engaged in some of that, more so with the folks who have a primary safety role, as we would expect. But we can also see that as some of those skills, we moved to some of the more advanced skills, engagement of that was a little bit lower. So this was a metric that we could also use to help connect and associate through correlation and regression analyses with some of the other beliefs and behaviors that we'd looked at previously. So this gave us some insights about the level of engagement and things that were occurring in these DOTs that participated in the survey. So then we wanted to tie that together with their sense of strong knowledge and skills around traffic safety. We looked at a variety of different skills, their ability to access crash data, understand crash data, starting to make meaning of the crash data by looking at contributing factors, moving beyond just making meaning. Could they identify strategies to potentially address those factors and deploy strategies? And then what was their ability to evaluate the efficacy of those strategies, interpret the evaluations, and ultimately tie, I think, all those pieces together in terms of making data-driven decisions about investing resources. So we looked at each of these. Now, the way we did this is have them self-report. We did not use testing or other kinds of measures. So this is a self-report measure, and really what we're assessing here is, in essence, their perceived self-efficacy to engage in these kinds or around these kinds of skills. That's one measure of their skill. It's certainly not necessarily the only measure, but it gives us a sense as to how they're feeling about their confidence and ability to engage in these. And as we can see, they have a stronger sense around some of the basic skills of accessing crash data and understanding crash data, and confidence goes down as we get to the more complex skills, and certainly indicating an opportunity to grow these. And these results are only of those individuals who reported that they had a primary safety function. So this is not amongst the general population of all employees in a DOT, but those who are focused on really having safety as a part of their work. So again, we have a sense that folks are reporting they're moderately certain they can do some of the advanced skills, which helps us realize there's definitely opportunity for growth there, but we have a strong foundation to begin with. So some of the key insights, there's definitely room for improvement. We can see that in terms of the safety skills. There's a sense that we could enhance opportunities for working on some of those higher level skills, but as we look back at access does become an issue. And we could look at and explore some ideas in terms of enhancing access to training by looking at some of those more accessible methods in terms of online training, and are there opportunities to explore doing things with their internal trainers because those are the most accessible options. So what kind of mechanisms or systems could we create to leverage those existing systems? So that was some of the basics that we learned from the survey work. We're going to pause here and do another poll and have an opportunity for you to ask questions. And then we'll switch it over and allow Dana to talk about what she learned when she went into greater depth with some of the interviews. So at this point, if you want to type in on that chat window on the left-hand side any questions that you have, we'll try to respond to those now. And you can also, in a moment, when we launch the poll, you can respond to the poll as well.
Thank you very much, Jay. And again, while you guys are putting any questions that you might have into that chat pod, we do have our next poll break for you. This poll is, which of the following factors are predictive of utilization of training? Is it the safety climate, individual readiness, access, or all of the above? Hey Jay, it does look like everybody has voted, so I've gone ahead and broadcasted those results for you.
Great. So yes, as folks realized, we really came out with all of the above. Safety climate and individual readiness as being important, both of those being ones that stood out, from safety climate standing out on the prioritization of safety, individual readiness standing out as an element within the support for workforce development component. Both of those were predictive of access, and access became very important in terms of utilization. So all of those three components coming together. So just taking a quick scan over at the chat box. I'm not sure if anybody had any questions or comments that came in. We'll have additional time to talk about those as well. Jamie, did you see anything come in?
Yep, we do have one question for you. Could you explain how could a DOT training department take a greater role in building the capacity of their safety professionals?
So I think that's a dynamite question, and I think that is one that we absolutely want to explore. I think what we want to do is press pause on that question right now and allow Dana to go through, because Dana went in and interviewed folks to learn more about some of the things that agencies were doing. So I think some of her presentation will give some insights on that, and then really bring that back. And I think that's a core question we want to explore, both as the Safety Center, but also in partnership with DOTs and others, because I think that is a critical idea and one that can really bolster our access, especially when we think of trying to broaden these skills out to more folks, and just aspects of addressing which every agency addresses, sort of turnover and things like that. So let's press pause on that and then come back to that as a group, but we'll let Dana jump into her part and what she learned through the interviews. So Dana, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay. This portion of the webinar is going to cover the third learning outcome for this session, and that's to discuss the different forms of strategy that state DOTs can undertake to increase future utilization of workforce training and education tools and resources. As Jay mentioned, as a qualitative portion of this project, we had interviews with some state DOTs to discuss with them how they were utilizing their staff and getting them up to capacity on various safety-related skills. And that this portion of the study really speaks to, if you're looking at the predictive model that's on the screen now, the section about implementing best practices in database decisions. We were hoping that here we would, one, be able to understand some things from the interviews that we could not tease out of a survey, and also to understand some of the lessons learned that the state DOTs already had, could share with us about the ways that they train their employees and they get them up to speed on some of the safety-related components of their work. Just to give you a little bit of background, we interviewed 4 states, 4 of the 6 states that participated in the survey. 2 of them were high-performing states and 2 were low-performing states. The states were pretty much geographically distributed, and just to give you the size of their infrastructure and their performance, the VMTs range from 12,000 to 57,500 for the 4 states. And also, just as a data point, we looked at, of course, far more than just 2014 data, but in the year 2014, the fatality rate for these 4 states ranged from 0.57 to 1.58. And that year, in 2014, the national rate was 1.08. So as you can see, the 4 states that we talked with kind of covered the gamut, and that way we were looking at strategies that all of them might be using. This slide is just showing how we organized the interviews. We thought there were 3 major components of workforce development where safety is concerned, and we thought it would be good to sort of differentiate between the 3. The first one is roadway safety data and analysis. These components were also teased out in the survey that was done for the first phase of the project, but we, for this portion, looked at how they were analyzing crash data and other safety data, and we also were speaking from the perspective of how they identify their safety challenges and prioritize projects. The second component is safety effectiveness evaluations, and that's looking at how they evaluate project effectiveness and how they evaluate their safety program overall. And then finally, the third component is investment decision making. In this component, we wanted to look at the tools that they were using to estimate potential project cost benefits and how they were identifying projects and programs with the greatest impact. These were the 3 areas that we focused on capacity building questions for, and I am going to present a slide on each one of those in terms of some of the best practices that we found. In the first area of roadway safety analysis, interviewees were building the capacity of staff in roadway safety analysis by doing a few things. Very commonly, they were developing some type of in-house analytical tool and providing staff training. One of the important aspects of this is that it allowed them to have a more uniform analytical process, and it helped to give all staff that were performing those analyses a broader understanding of the analyses that were expected. Some of the in-house tools that were developed assisted staff in comparing crashes and crash trends, statewide safety performance functions, and even calibrating highway safety manual spreadsheets. So all of these were some in-house tools that were being used to make sure that their staff had the capacity to do their jobs and to complete safety analyses that were on par with what was required. One state had even began including a safety analysis in every pavement preservation project, and this became the department's policy. So that was another result of having a process that was laid out and making sure that staff were trained properly. Some other areas or tips and tricks that were being used, besides incorporating safety analysis into their standard procedures, they also followed the national research on data analysis and had their staff to participate in trainings that are hosted at the national level and just staying on top of the things that were coming out of the national research to understand what were the new and cutting-edge techniques that they needed to have their staff trained on. And then, of course, the final piece was providing on-the-job training. You'll find as we talk about all 3 of these areas that all of the states felt that the best training and capacity building that they could provide was for their staff to work alongside someone with experience in learning how to do their jobs better and understand the ins and outs of safety analysis. So in the second area, looking at safety effectiveness evaluations, some of the things that were done to build capacity in staff in this area, which we found that even within the states interviewed, they seem to have to rate themselves slightly lower in terms of their performance in this area, but they were providing on-the-job training opportunities. They also noted that in a lot of cases, the same staff person did these types of analyses, and that made the process more uniform, and that person became sort of the go-to person. It also allowed the person to learn more and have repeat experience. Of course, we understand that that can also be to the detriment of staff turnover if you have a single person who, for the most part, handles a particular task, but it did allow for some institutional knowledge to be held with one person and to make sure that procedures were repeatable. Another area for this particular component was looking at providing highway safety manual training that went above and beyond the introductory content that's provided in some of the introductory trainings that are available. And those were often provided either in a peer-to-peer exchange between states or having a consultant to come in and provide some training. And finally, in the area of investment decision making, there were three major components of the techniques that were used to build capacity in staff. The first one was, of course, developing in-house tools. They streamlined the processes, and they also helped in the same way with data analysis to provide a uniform process and to give staff some guidance. They also worked to expose new staff to project-specific work and on-the-job training. They felt that that was one of the best ways to get staff up to speed, for them to see something in real time and understand what their responsibilities were and how to make the procedures that were set up work properly. And then, of course, all of the folks that we interviewed felt that it was very important to cross-train staff with other planning areas. For example, and actually not just planning areas, but other areas in the DOT in general. So many of the folks who were responsible for deciding what type of training opportunities were given to their safety staff also had the responsibility of determining when staff from other parts of the DOT could benefit from the training and inviting them to the training or making that training available to those staff. Maybe it's someone in design, or it could be someone in operations or maintenance, but that person who was responsible for looking at just the safety staff also had an eye to making sure that when there was training available for their staff, if it made sense for staff from other areas to participate, that they opened it up and made it available and made the section leader for those areas aware of it. So overall, we found that there was a lot of on-the-job training and other tools that were developed in-house to help with capacity building. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Jay Otto, and he's going to talk about some opportunities that we would like to coalesce around for the remainder of the webinar on how all agencies can look at building capacity and safety.
Great, thanks, Dana. So that gave us, the interviews gave us, as Dana mentioned, just more in-depth, that much richer knowledge that a survey doesn't necessarily provide. So just to tie some of these pieces together as we look at some of the things we learn and look forward then towards some of the opportunities, I think one insight was this notion of how safety climate being different than just focusing on the safety of the general public, but that sense of climate within the organization about its own safety performance, and how that is related and becomes an opportunity to bolster overall safety performance in terms of addressing the community at large. So building that connection back, that it's not just about thinking of the broad public, but also that can begin with really focusing on growing the safety climate within the organization as an opportunity. Recognizing that on sort of looking at some of the best practice around training and workforce development, that the survey did reveal some opportunities to improve in some of the systems within DOTs to bolster, I think, the engagement with training and then the application of training. So while individuals had reported high motivation to learn new things, their sense of expectations to apply new ideas was lower. And that might in fact be a misperception. So again, working with supervisors and managers, perhaps more senior leadership teams as well, to really communicate more about the expectations of learning and applying new ideas, so that expectation aligns with that motivation that individuals have to learn new ideas. There are opportunities to help, I think, as was revealed, identify opportunities for training, and again, that's something that supervisors and managers can potentially take on more of a role. And then that big piece about what happens after the training and the critical importance of processing the training with an individual, and then really talking about, okay, so how does this relate to your job role? How will you take what you learned and apply it? And maybe even how a supervisor or manager can support that in the future so that it really gets applied. So that was something that individuals, across the board, that was scored much lower, and I think really reveals an opportunity just in terms of bolstering the efficacy of training across the board. When we think about some of the aspects of specifically around the safety, seeing that there is definitely opportunity to build safety skills around these three core areas, that they ranked moderate in terms of their perceived self-efficacy, and definitely an opportunity to grow those. So that these skills are important, and there's definitely opportunity to grow those. So sort of recognizing that perhaps just as a goal for an organization to improve their safety skills in those areas. And that we need to think about how we can increase training opportunities for those higher level skills. As Dana mentioned, there was a strong sense of on-the-job training, and that's critically important because clearly these are complex skills and they need practice. They're hard to do in the abstract. But thinking about, I think, that notion of how we can leverage, as we're able to, online training resources for that. Perhaps that could be creating some simulations or other techniques that could be engaged in online training, but also thinking about, and I think shifting some of our thinking, that the work needs to be about almost a different paradigm of train the trainer. So how are we thinking about some of those individuals within organizations who have very strong skills, and then really recognizing their role as a trainer? Working with internal trainers, full-time trainers within DOTs, maybe engaging them in some of building their capacity to do some of this training. So really thinking about it from the train-the-trainer model as opposed to just the simple traditional train-the-student model, so that we can bolster that growth that is naturally occurring, as Dana shared, through sort of informal systems, and maybe making those more formal and really thinking about it through that lens of train the trainer. So with that, we want to come back to another chance to ask some questions, in particular asking questions about anything that Dana shared, and we also have the polling question that focuses on Dana's comments as well.
That is correct. So this will be one of the last, or if not the last, question and answer session we have. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat pod on the left-hand side. Our poll question for you is: developing in-house tools to streamline analysis process can help build staff capacity by doing which of the following? Ensuring analysis procedures are clear for all staff and all analysis is completed for every project. Providing a uniform set of assumptions for calculations. Both A and B, or none of the above. And then I do have a few questions that have come in, but if there are any more, please go ahead and post those in the chat pod. Okay, and it does look like we are all set with the poll, so I'm going to go ahead and broadcast the results. Jay, if you'd like to go ahead and address this one.
Sure. So this was following up from Dana's piece as well, and A and D being looking at both of those components as she found through her interviews with the agencies as being important towards building staff capacity. So we had the majority of folks recognizing it was both A and B. So great.
Perfect. Thank you. My first question that I have in here is from Dana. Dana, from your interviews with the agencies, what is your sense of how important training is to these organizations?
The sense that we got from the interviews was that all of the organizations felt that training was very important. None of them took the approach of just assuming that whatever training was required by the DOT as a whole was enough. Several of the organizations, their DOTs had a capacity building program that all employees were required to go through. But in addition to that, they took the initiative to also provide training opportunities to their staff that were specific to their functions. In this case, they were all safety-related functions. So they addressed and agreed with the fact that there were certain requirements for the DOT, but they also felt the responsibility as the lead for their groups that they should both be on top of what was being done nationally and internationally in research and understanding what was available that they could either bring to their DOT as a training opportunity, or if budgets and time allowed, send staff to training for, but that there were additional opportunities above and beyond what was required or outlined as what they would expect a DOT employee to do.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dana. And the other question, I believe, is for either Jay or Nick. It seems like from looking at the model that it's a little complicated, and if I wanted to test my own organization or agency and see how well we're doing and maybe find out what some of the things we could do to better improve our safety training, how would I go about doing that? Would I call you? Is there a survey I can use? I know at the beginning it was mentioned that you were going to be kicking this off for locals, so if I'm a local agency, who would I contact?
Good question. I'll answer first, and then Jay, if you want to follow up. Our center is actually putting together a program of research to help agencies examine their own culture using a similar methodology, and then develop some guidance and recommendations for that agency to change their culture. We're calling it a cohort research program. It's a bit like a pool fund, but it's not run through the Federal Highway Program. It's a cohort of state DOTs who think they could benefit from this approach, each contributing a smaller amount of money than they might if they were doing it just by themselves, and by pooling the funding across multiple states, it sort of leveraged the funds and let this work more efficiently with those states at a lower cost to examine their own local culture and give some recommendations for them on how to transform that in a direction they wish to do so. Jay, any more thoughts on that?
Sure. At the should be about the end of this month, it'll be officially released, will be the final report from the project. And in that, and there's an appendix that shows a sample report that we created for just one agency. And the results were presented in a slightly different fashion than we did here, and it really was more of a descriptive analysis, just looking at responses But that was, I think, helpful for some DOTs to just get a general feel as to how folks are responding. So that the survey that was used will also be included in that report. We could explore whether there are mechanisms to implement that survey with another agency, and then create a report like that. But it would give you a sense of what you could look at just within your own agency and starting to explore. I think some of those questions are very interesting to ask, sort of what do you believe and what do you think your supervisors believe, and up the chain. We often reveal some misperceptions there. And just to get a sense of how folks are feeling about safety, about training and access and those different things. So that all those tools will be available in that final report, and then you could potentially contact us in terms of maybe if there are aspects of trying to implement those components. But there are a lot more detail in that final report coming.
So just to summarize, if there's any state DOTs who are interested in applying this within their own organization, just give me a contact and I'll give you some more information about the program that we're trying to develop to support specific DOTs.
Thank you, Jay and Nick. And up on the screen, you all should see the final report information that Jay was talking about. It will be available on the Safety Center's website on our research page when it is completed. And as we do with everything, it will go out through our newsletter and our distribution list and be posted on all of our social media as well as soon as it's available. There is a future research and next steps for this project too, which would address the local piece of the question that was just asked. And Nick, if you'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about this before we close out the webinar.
Sure. We recognized in doing this initial project with state DOTs that given their size and resources and their jurisdictions, they're fundamentally different in terms of the operational environment and perhaps also in some cultural aspects from local traffic safety agencies such as city and county, as well as being different from some of the tribal traffic safety agencies. So we're hoping to develop a research program to look specifically at the smaller, less resourced types of agencies typical of local and tribal agencies. And we're exploring how best to recruit those types of agencies. So if you are one of those local or tribal agencies, or you have contact with one that maybe you think benefit and interested or curious about learning more about this possible project, please feel free to use my contact information here to contact us.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So in today's webinar, we're hoping that you learned how to describe the proposed model that relates cultural and operational factors to the utilization of workforce training and education tools and resources, to understand those factors that are most predicative of such utilization with a sample of state DOTs, and to discuss different forms of strategies that state DOTs can undertake to increase future utilization of workforce training and education tools and resources. We do hope that from the survey results you were able to pick up on a few things that maybe you could try in your own organization. And again, if you are interested in, as a state DOT, potentially looking at this report, you can contact Nick or Jay. I'll give you their emails again one more time at the end of this presentation, or you can just as well email us at the info@ruralsafetycenter.org. We can put you in touch with them. And also get you a copy of the report when it's finished. And the same thing if you are a local agency or tribal agency who is interested in participating in our next round of research, please contact one of the three of us. We do have several upcoming webinars that are already scheduled. Our next one will be held on Valentine's Day from 11 to 12:30 Mountain Time. It will be on the new Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks guide that was created. This is a non-motorized guide that is local and rural in nature, and we will have the consultant Alta Planning do a presentation on this for us. On Thursday, March 9th, from 11 to 12:30 p.m. Mountain Time, we will have FHWA and NHTSA doing a presentation on safety performance management. And what some of the legislation rules mean for state DOTs and how locals can provide them with data and help out with some of these legislation pieces that have come down. And then in April, we will have a webinar on unpaved roads. Tuesday, April 4th, again from 11 to 12:30 Mountain Time. As always, you can access all of these recorded webinars on our website. We do also have the Introduction to Road Safety Culture video as well, available on our website under our multimedia sub-tab. And we did discuss road safety culture quite a bit today, so that is available there. As well as today, organizational culture was discussed quite a few times. There are 2 webinars that were done previously on organizational culture that are available on our archived website as well. So again, if you guys are interested in signing up for our free emails or following us on social media, please do that. You can sign up on our homepage on the right-hand side for our distribution list if you do not already receive it. And one more time, here are Nick, Jay, and Dana's email addresses if you do have any further questions after today's webinar. So thank you again for attending, and thank you so much to Jay, Nick, and Dana for presenting. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.